I think Motopia is inherently difficult to describe in one sentence. I think that one way to think of it would be the incorporation of mobile elements into utopic architecture.
What does it mean to me, the word Motopia? It obviously is a conflation of motor and utopia, and utopia is an imagined ideal situation that has to do almost with paradise, I think, an eternally blissful, happy state of affairs.
It's kind of difficult to summarize what Motopia exactly means, because it seems to me it's two words put together. It's motors, I guess automobiles, and utopia. And the idea of them two things being together doesn't seem to be about architecture at all. But I guess what the organisers have thought about is the idea that automobiles come from a certain sort of design background in terms of they are manufactured in a factory, they're manufactured as on a production line, and yet they have a kind of design energy and individualism which gets people excited. And so I'm interested in the sort of architecture which also has that energy, which also has that innovation, and also has that dynamism which moving objects like cars have. And so I think it's kind of an intriguing title for a symposium, and so I was interested to take part.
I think there are many devices and technologies affecting the design of architecture today, for better, for worse. Years ago I went to go visit Cisco's home of the future, and the engineer there kept telling me that you could turn the oven on from the backyard, and this to me was an example of technology used for no good reason. just because you could do it didn't mean that you should do it. And so I think we're at a stage of figuring out when is technology and mobile applications and those sorts of things, when are they important, when are they actually helping, and when are they just sort of showing off? And I don't think at all that the profession has found the right happy medium yet, but is sort of exploring all the different aspects of that right now.
I think the idea of flexibility in architecture has changed dramatically over the last 20, 30 years. There used to be a phrase in the past which was called long life, loose fit, and what this essentially meant was you made a building which was kind of loose, was not really tied closely to the problem of how it would be used, and that meant that you could change it as time went on. I think this was a mistake, because you end up with buildings which are not so good. They're not so good enough to actually fulfill the functions for which they're designed. It's far better to design a building which really is very closely linked to its function, so people can understand the way it works, and it can be very successful as a building. But within that function there is also the ability for it to be changed easily when things change. And it's not so difficult to do as one might think, because it just needs a lot more preparation at the beginning when you're doing the design, rather than just sort of doing something very quickly. So I guess there is a cost in that. You have to spend longer working on the design. You can't predict what's going to come in the future. But what you can do is you can think about how change might take place, and the sort of and allow for that.
We have to answer that by thinking of what flexibility gives you. It gives you flexibility, and I don't mean so much building parts. I mean the flexibility to react to different situations.
There are some sexy ways I've seen that, and some less sexy ways that I've seen that, sort of depending on what perspective you're coming at it from. A super flexible architecture may be a house that's designed with an accessory dwelling unit, which is more commonly known as a granny flat. It's flexible in that it could accommodate a growing family or a relative that returns to live, whether it's, you know, an aging parent or a college student. That's very flexible architecture. It's allowing for different use. That's probably not too exciting to deep thinkers in architecture, though. Important, but very different. Flexibility, probably of the sort that we'll talk about a lot tonight, would have to do with this idea that you could build a house and then take it apart piece by piece, reinstall it somewhere else, maybe in a different configuration, that it could be sort of ever evolving and changing to the needs of its user, things like that. There's an interesting tension between those two desires that I'd love to see meet in the middle, because both are equally important.
I have rather a jaded view of how mobility, or the concept of it, in people's minds has changed. It seemed much more promising to me 30 years ago than it does now, because the stars of the architectural firmament have forgotten about it completely. Now, that's a blanket statement to make, just waiting for contradiction, but generally I would say most of the buildings have nothing to do with flexibility or expendability. They're built as one-off jewels of exotic form.
People sometimes think that mobility and flexibility in architectural design is only appropriate for specific building types or specific problems, but actually it has a lot of potential to be used in lots of different areas. And in fact, when you're designing a building which has mobile functions, which has to move from place to place, and it has a specific site, but that specific site is actually just happens to be in different locations. The information and the experience that you gain by designing that sort of building is actually applicable to other buildings as well. And so these sorts of buildings actually are quite innovative. And the innovation which they develop can be used in other architecture as well, the more static, the cheaper architecture. And so it actually has a big part to play, that these sort of groundbreaking designs, people learn about that and then they can use them in sort of more mundane applications later on.
Rayner Banham was getting at a few things. One, people are always moving. They're always in their car, and so much of architecture is experienced as you're driving by it. And I think that was definitely integral to Rayner Banham's experience of Los Angeles. Another form of movement is that there are not that many old buildings in Los Angeles, so things are just moving. You see something and then you don't see it again. I don't think his idea of architecture as movement is quite in keeping with the sort of flexibility and mobility and portability that we're talking about here. Some of the movement that Banham might have been referring to would have had to do with, ever-changing architectural styles and sort of movements. But I think he was writing some decades ago, and I think it's sort of a different perspective, but certainly relevant to the discussion that we're having.
Well, prefabrication's been around forever. The first buildings that were ever made were made with prefabricated components. Some of the greatest, largest buildings that ever built were made with prefabricated components, going back right through centuries. Some people look at prefabrication as a cheap way of doing things, and it somehow, in some cases, got a bad reputation, that it's kind of like, makes architecture which is not so dedicated to its function, not so high quality. And I think what Eames did is that he took standard off-the-peg components and assembled into something which was quite beautiful. And so it's actually the thought went into the assembly process and the understanding what the components could achieve that he revealed as a new way forward in design. And prefabrication is something which, when designers get involved with it, they get excited about it, and they make great buildings. And I think I'm not saying that prefabrication is the only way to make buildings. Quite clearly, that's not the case. But it is perhaps a slightly undervalued tool in making great architecture, as opposed to just building.
And I first want to thank Visions and Voices, the USC Arts and Humanities Initiative, for funding tonight's event. This is a campus-wide event that is not just targeted at architecture, but has a bigger voice. I want to thank our Dean, Dean Ma, and the School of Architecture for hosting this event tonight. And I wanted to thank all of you here for participating in what I consider to be an historic moment. Certainly in my career, it's an idea that I've been thinking about for maybe 2 decades or so. And the kind of manifestation of this today is quite heady for me. The founding and manifesto of futurism appeared in full on the front page of Le Figaro on February 20th, 1909. With this advertisement proclaiming the birth of futurism, Filippo Marinetti launched the first cultural movement of the 20th century. And his intention was to aim at a direct mass audience. Along with Antonio Sant'Elia, they declared, quote, "We have lost our predilection for the monumental, the heavy, the static. We have enriched our sensibility with a taste for the light, the practical, the ephemeral, and the swift." Over 100 years ago, the futurists insisted upon change. Today, November 2nd, 2011, the speakers you are about to hear will bring to life the contemporary discourse surrounding these original dynamic statements. Very quickly, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Alison Arieff, who will be our moderator this evening, editor-at-large for the Atlantic Cities, contributing columnist for the New York Times, working mom. Stephen Kieran, partner in Kieran Timberlake, does a lot of work in prefabrication. Robert Cronenberg, who's just flown in from London to be with us today, architect, author, Roscoe Chair of Architecture at the University of Liverpool, and who I first met maybe 10 or 15 years ago at the first conference on portable architecture in Singapore. And Michael Webb, founding member of Archigram, professor at Cooper Union, whose work I have admired for my entire career. So thank you all for being here. And I do believe that there are more seats if anyone wants to get comfortable in the front. For the standing room only crowd, this is very exciting. I'm going to turn the floor over to Alison, who's going to start this evening's proceedings. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if you want to use this or not.
I probably should.
Sorry.
Thanks, Jennifer, for having me. I'm a graduate of UCLA, so thank you, USC, for allowing me on campus. As many of you know, I wrote a book called Prefab that was published in 2002, and little did I know that it would come to sort of define my career. At a time, Jennifer and I and a number of other architects were doing so many lectures on the topic that we were thinking of getting concert t-shirts, Austin, Boston, New York. So that's slowed a little bit for a little bit of time, but definitely I've felt a huge resurgence of interest in it again over the last couple of years, as evidenced by many things. I'm going to spend most of the evening letting all the speakers talk. I just have a few opening remarks about initial observations about what the speakers are going to be talking about tonight, and then of course we'll have a great Q&A when they're done. So mobile. It contains layers of meaning it didn't have just a few years ago. I remember when Jennifer and I might have talked about mobile architecture in, say, 2002, maybe we had cell phones. I don't know. So all of the associations that we currently have with mobile are so new, and it just seems unthinkable that they are, but they play such a big role in all the sort of things we'll be talking about tonight. So mobile has been a pervasive theme in architecture, yet consistently hard to pin down. Too on the move, indeed too mobile to be pinned down. But now it's inserted itself inextricably from architectural practice, as any AT&T commercial will tell you. When you're on the phone, you're already in your office. But as Robert Cronenberg points out, there are many limits to mobility as options. He says in the handout that you have, you might be able to change your refrigerator temperature from 1,000 miles away, but this should not affect the fundamental qualities of human appreciation of space, place, and time. That was my sentiment exactly when I visited Cisco's Home of the Future in 2000 in the Silicon Valley. The engineer giving me a tour of the so-called Home of the Future, which always are round in popular conceptions of them, by the way, couldn't stop bragging to me about the fact that you could turn the oven on from the backyard of the house. And I kept saying, has anyone ever expressed an interest in turning the oven on from the backyard of the house? And to me, it was the perfect example of doing something with technology because you could do it, as opposed to doing something with technology that might actually be useful. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we sort of all face with technology now. Do you add extra insulation to your attic, or do you put a $50,000 solar array on it? You know, which is going to have more bang for the buck? The more seductive thing is the solar panels. In fact, the more useful thing might be the very unsexy insulation. So what of mobile architecture then? Should the building itself move? Should it have moving parts? For Archigram, mobility was about buildings constantly changing their size and shape. This was desirable in order for those structures to, as Webb has observed, accommodate themselves to changing levels of occupancy, levels of meteorological conditioning, or changing users' needs. It seems like Webb and his cohorts were fascinated, not surprisingly, by process, because buildings, once completed, just sat there around doing nothing. That's, of course, what most buildings are doing. If not nothing exactly, then not very much. Buckminster Fuller exhorted us to pay attention to this decades ago when he said, our beds are empty 2/3 of the time, our living rooms are empty 7/8 of the time, our office buildings are empty 1/2 the time. It's time we gave this some thought. But have we? We hear about living walls, breathing buildings, and more things. But in the end, buildings are a vessel for the people in them. They're not actually moving. They're not really living and breathing in the ways that we might get to tonight. They're expanding in the very not avant-garde way of kitchen renovations and attic build-outs, and that doesn't exactly feel very organic or innovative to me. American housing is entrenched in this idea of mobility, yet now finds itself in the antithesis of mobility. Housing was never mobile. The residents were never truly tied to home or place, but they were totally tied to the perceived resale value. Now that that's gone, what does that mean for mobility? Will a truly mobile architecture be mobile? As we'll hear later on, Stephen Kieran thinks not. While the rate at which we all change our place of habitation, slow down. While the rate at which we all change our place of habitation is increasing, writes Kieran, it's difficult to imagine that many of us will ever be able to just pick up and leave, taking our dwelling with us. But interestingly, Cronenberg feels a little bit differently. The idea of the house is more important than the idea of the mobile house. People are quite happy with the house, regardless of whether it's mobile or not. To be able to take the house with you that embodies your desires and holds your memories sounds an exciting prospect. Is that a way to retrofit suburbia? So just move the houses along, though most frankly aren't worth saving and moving. These are some of the things we'll get at tonight. To close and to digress for a moment, many of the things we'll all be discussing this evening, prefab in particular, have really come to define much of my own interest and career. I'm excited to explore here the ever-evolving yet puzzlingly stagnant realities of prefabrication, while it continues to mesmerize the design community and why it can still be defined, and fairly, as a series of noble failures. And I'm sure that's provocative, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. And with that, let's get the proverbial show on the road. Thank you. And we start with Robert.
Just a few words first. Thank you very much, Alison. That was provocative, I think, a great start. And thank you to everyone for coming this evening. I think I get the prize for the furthest travelled, so I can afford to be a little bit cheeky at the beginning and say everyone is standing outside the door. There are plenty of seats down here at the front. Please come in and get a seat and enjoy the talk. Come on. I don't mind. Make a little bit of noise. Come in. Sit down. This is an amazing event which Jennifer's put together. To be here on a stage with Stephen Kieran, who I think is a partner in one of the leading architectural practices in the world. Alison, whose amazing book was really set out, really the definitive book on prefab up to this point in time. And Michael, whose work I still look at and get inspiration from. To be here on the stage with them is really amazing for me. So when I asked Jennifer what she wants me to talk about this evening, I said, I've been working on a new project, I've been doing these things. And she said, no, set the ground. So the stuff you're going to see tonight from me is kind of like a gallop in 20 minutes, probably 4 slides a minute, through the kind of like the definition, the history of this topic. And it'll be a little bit garbled, a little bit fast, so you better pay attention and keep up. I've been doing this stuff for a while. About 20 years, I got interested in it when I was a student in college, into the competition, designed a mobile exhibition pavilion, and surprise, surprise, I won it. We built it for the RIBA, it lasted for 6 months. And then when I went into practice, one of the first jobs I got was to design a temporary pavilion. And this temporary pavilion was quite successful, so much so that after 15 years, the temporary pavilion was still there. And what I discovered was that mobility in architecture can actually be something that, if it's successful, it lasts a lot longer. Sometimes it lasts a lot longer in the same place. Sometimes it lasts a lot longer in different places. But the same site, it just happens to be geographically different. The top left book there, Houses in Motion, is actually my first book. I think it's published 1995. That one's from 2002. I've called this lecture Houses in Motion because I'm just working on a new edition, which is going to come out in 2013, and it was the first time I've actually started to think about that original idea again. I've also been involved in exhibitions. The reason I put these up, particularly this one, Living in Motion, is this is an exhibition which I helped curate for the Vitra Design Museum. It lasted for 5 years, toured throughout Europe and North America. The catalogue and the exhibition was the most successful one they've ever had. Now, why was that? It wasn't because of me, though I like to think it was. No, I don't. It wasn't because of Vitra. It was because the topic is so interesting to people. They have this interest in an idea of architecture which is dynamic, which is kinetic, which moves. This is a project I've been working on now. A little plug. The book comes out in a couple of months' time, and it's about architecture of popular music. And there's something of that in this lecture as well. So first of all, portable architecture definition. Well, basically, it's mobile architecture. Buildings that relocate from place to place. Architecture that rolls, floats, or I'm sorry. I was a bit fast then. There we go. It's architecture that rolls, floats, or flies. It's a permanent architecture that happens to utilize temporary sites. It might last only for a day, but it can have permanent influence and benefits. It's often prefabricated, lightweight, and innovative. It seems to be the kineticism, this mobility, this has an innate potency. Movement is a sign of vitality, as Chuck Homan says it there. Movement is also representative of freedom. Movable environments are more dynamic than static ones. And movable architecture that uses the image of movement is ultimately sterile, but actually it's also quite fun and kitsch, and who cares? That's fun. Architecture, this leads us to the question, why should architecture be static? Because often it isn't. An appropriate architecture can take many forms. So let's look at some of the characteristics of mobile and prefabricated and flexible architecture. Early made artifacts were portable because they were more useful and efficient, and these reasons are still relevant today. These are two buildings from two ends of the spectrum, a desert dwelling, very simple, made from the materials close to hand, and a floating hotel made by Mitsu Engineering. It's called Polycastle, designed for oil workers to take rest days. Responsive architecture is adaptable both to different functions but also to users and locations. This is a British firm called Tectonics. They make inflatable structures, develop their own technology to create these inflatable structures. They can make the structure in any sort of form, shape, in any environment. And the great thing about this technology is it's extremely low tech. It's almost bouncy castle technology. I don't know if you know what I mean by bouncy castle. It's very, very low air pressure stuff, so if something goes wrong with it, it's easy to repair. It's also easy to construct and easy to relocate. Its relevance can be measured by its effect on people, not by how old it is. And there's three examples here. There's on the left at the top there is just a circus train arriving in town. On the right is a fantastic exhibition which took place in 1951 in Great Britain, which kind of set the scene for contemporary architecture that was going to happen over the next 10, 15 years. And then at the bottom, the Roskilde Festival, a festival that's been going for over 20 years, incredibly resonant festival in this very same location each time, but recreated in a different form. In the world of cloud technology, teleworking, social networking, global markets, the World Wide Web, and other fast and cheap communications, including fast transportation, portable architecture is an expression of a society in flux. But instead of being a poor response to a temporary problem, it can be a new response to contemporary changing circumstances. And here's a great example. On the top left is American Airlines made by portable pavilion made by Bird Air in the 1950s. And about 50 years later on the right, here's a project done by Klein Dytham actually built in Japan, which is for a different airline. It's for Virgin, and again using inflatable technology. Portable architecture has a unique value and relevance that makes it worthy of exploitation. It can be a life-saving design, such as these mobile huts which were made for the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, or these paper shelters designed by Shigeru Ban for the 1995 Kobe earthquake. Portable architecture also provides a sense of place without stasis. I like this image. This is in Amsterdam. It's actually a houseboat, but the owner of the houseboat has adopted the space just by putting out these little bits of plants and a little picket fence. It also provides architectural identity without permanence. This is a project by a firm of designers called Public Art Lab, and it was something called mobile museums, moved around from city to city. Each city, the objects which you see here were actually adapted by different groups of artists to make different sorts of statements about what they wanted to talk about in their city. Very, very simple, low technology cubes, but really kind of creating a new sense of place in the public spaces in which they inhabited. This sort of architecture can also establish continuity without permanent building. And we're talking here about things like history, traditions, occupation. This top one is quite an interesting project. It's by a German architect called Wilk Salinas. It's in Berlin. And it was for a mobile bathhouse, which was on the river, which goes through the center of Berlin. This is something which had been happening for actually over 100 years, but they created a new one, which actually added something new and special to that experience. So it was partly tradition, but it was also partly innovation. And on below, just an ordinary circus. Circus tents like that have been in existence for about 150 years. It's a technology which is kind of designed specifically for that function and really hasn't changed at all. In fact, Stromae, the tent makers, are the same company, have been in existence for over 100 years, making these same tents. It can also have many practical characteristics. It can be reusable, recyclable, sustainable. And you may have seen this project, Shigeru Ban's Nomadic Museum, one of his buildings which is actually created with very little movable structures at all, because it just uses the materials which happen to be at the site. In this case, primarily containers, although the big structures, the paper tubes which make up the roof structure and the membrane, are shipped from location to location. And this one was on the east coast of America, here, I believe, in Los Angeles, and also in Tokyo. And also in different forms as well, not in the same format each time, changed depending on the site. So mobile architecture takes advantage of technology transfer. And the three aspects it really sort of investigates are compression, tension, and the pneumatic. And I like these two images because they sort of talk about that technology in a very sort of dynamic way. On the left, we have the Cutty Sark from 1869, and on the right, we have the Wright glider from 1899, and they've got those things in it: compression, tension, and pneumatics. But also very lightweight, which is very important for mobility. Post-war architecture implements current technology faster. New materials, structural forms, lightweight, reusable. And I put this project up because I still kind of like it. It's the MOMI Pavilion, designed by Future Systems and Peter Rice, built in the UK in 1993. All not exactly brand new materials here, but using existing high-tech materials, but in a new way that they hadn't been done before. Carbon fiber protrusions formed the structure of the building, these circular arches, and those sorts of protrusions were previously used in things like fishing rods, and new sorts of lightweight membranes to give it kind of like a translucent appearance. Post-war architecture also solves unsolvable problems, and I put up here 4 projects by one company, Weatherhaven. They're based in Burnaby, which is near Vancouver, and basically they make mobile buildings. You send them an email, say, I want a camp for 1,000 men in Alaska. The minimum temperature is going to be minus 36 degrees. The maximum temperature is going to be minus plus 80 degrees. And they deliver the whole package there. And they can assemble it for you, or inside there's a video which tells you how to assemble it. Anything, anywhere, to any sort of technological, environmental requirement. Portable architecture is often explored as experimental architecture. Experimental architecture challenges the preconception of what a building can be. Its designers are receptive to outside influences. And so here we have a NASA emergency bubble, survival bubble from the early 60s. The Navy Sea Fort from 1940. Some of these forts were actually built in Liverpool, where I'm from. Richard Horden's ski house from 95. And then Lotex MDU from 2004. Post-war architecture has a long and impressive history. First human-made buildings were portable, simple, and yet sophisticated. And here's 2 examples from the Tekna tribe. This wonderful tent created from a natural material. They know that the fabric's going to rot when it hits the ground, so it's constantly being remade with new sections being put into the ridge, which needs to be the strongest area. And all this furniture, which is constructed from componentized parts, prefabricated parts, which you can replace a part quite easily if it breaks, and which can be very lightweight and disassembled and mobile. Post-war architecture has an unchanging yet constantly it's constantly being remade. In many cases, it's the pattern book for permanent built form. This is a yurta or ger from the Central Asia. Again, these 3 things: prefabrication, compression and tension, and a geodetic structure. You could make this thing for about the cost of a month's wages. But again, prefabricated, actually mass-produced, because they have specialist manufacturers, craftsmen who make the different components, and then it's assembled together to make the building. Post-war architecture has been used in every aspect of human activity, and there's a couple of examples here. And I'm just saying here, sacred and health. This is Florence Nightingale's mobile field hospital from the Crimea in 1860s. It's been used in dwelling, and I love this picture. It's of the Sears Simplex sectional cottage from 1919. There's a little clock at the front. The clock takes 2 hours to assemble the building. Buckminster Fuller's DDU from 1940. And the mobile home on the road. Manufactured housing. 25% of all houses in the US are made from manufactured housing, an industry which is very successful for providing high quality housing at low cost. And then sort of kind of odd things like this. Horden Cherry Lee's Micro Compact Home from 2005, a very high spec mobile compact home. And I wanted to put this in as well. It's not mobile, but it is prefabricated, and it is adaptable. This is Frans van der Werf. Frans van der Werf is a Dutch architect who specializes in building housing for the elderly. And this is housing in which elderly people can move into, and it changes with them. It adapts to their lifestyle. As our bodies change, as we become older, we need different homes. But instead of having to move, they can stay in the same place. So this is like the opposite of portability, really. But it's actually about sort of responding to people's needs. Also used for art and culture. Here we have the Teatro del Mondo, the original one from 16th century Venice. And then Marco Maccola's Commedia dell'arte from Verona in 1772. A theatre, a mobile theatre, and all those aspects of a theatre that we know, those names like the boxes, things at the side, there actually are boxes, they are mobile objects. And of course today we're still dealing with mobile architecture. This is FTL. FTL are based in New York City. They're famous for doing entertainment buildings which are mobile. And so they fit out an aircraft hangar here to make a show. On the left, they did the Carlos Mosey Music Pavilion, a mobile stage that went for classical performance around all the city parks in New York for 15 years. And then Boston Harbor Lights, a theatre which is seasonal. And so the roof is taken away in the winter and then put up again in the summer. And then, of course, Mark Fisher from London, architect, been involved in creating amazing shows for the last 30 years. And this is a show which lasts 12 minutes, takes 6 minutes to bring the stuff on, and 6 minutes to take it off again. But it's seen by millions and millions of people around the world. And more recently, the U2 360-degree tour set. 3 of these were made, toured the world for 3 years. Each one cost 20 million to make, but the whole show obviously made a lot more. It actually made 760 million, something like that. Seen by millions and millions of people. Great designers involved in it, including Chuck Hoberman, who did the screen in the middle, which sort of contracts and expands. And when the show finishes, the thing is going to be, normally these shows are actually made up from components which can be reassembled in different ways, but because of the clout of U2, they could afford to make something special, and so it becomes a permanent exhibition item at the end. In commerce as well, this is the Crystal Palace, 1851, Joseph Paxton on the left, and on the right is a prediction of what they could do with all the components, because this was a massive, a prefabricated building, designed and then manufactured in 6 months. The proposal on the right was actually one made by the builders, the people who'd made the components, to say, well, what should we do with this building? It was only a temporary building, but let's reuse it. In fact, they rebuilt it again on a different site, and it lasted there until the 1930s, until it burnt down. But they didn't build it as a skyscraper, which is a pity. And a more recent version, the Heatherwick Studios British Pavilion for Expo 2010 in Shanghai. A kind of mobile building, 20 meters high, 60,000 transparent optical strands, each 7.5 meters long, containing seeds from Kew Gardens, dismantled after the show and distributed to schools in the UK and China, obviously prefabricated in the UK, but assembled in China. So experimentation diffuses preconceptions and can help architecture do new and different things. My final image of commerce is this wonderful kind of pod designed by Low-Tech again, kind of thinking about not only mobility but also technology, how you use technology in different ways. And so instead of the objects are actually contained in there in the different drawers that you pull out, but the screens on the front can show you as if you were wearing those clothes. Industry and military, Flip, which is a mobile laboratory which goes through 90 degrees when it gets to its site. Aircraft hangars by Butler. Butler used to make Butler bins in the Midwest, made out of aluminium, grain storage. A complete airport, all mobile. Finally, the Festo KG. Festo are an international, multinational company who work all around the world. They've got 160 factories globally, and they make the robots that make everything else. But they have an experimental design arm, and what they do with that is they try to make things out of air. And this is called the air texture hall. It's a piece of architecture. It has air beams, air panels, and pneumatic muscles that contract and expand when you put air into them. And so this leads to a building which is active rather than passive. It can be controlled, or it can be reactive to the environment around it. It's not a building that you build and then it stays the way it is. It's actually constantly moving or reacting. And finally, the biggest mobile building in existence, Valhalla. 24,000 square meters of area, 75 meters diameter, fits into 10 standard ISO containers. Actually built for one event, the Millennium Eve celebrations in Sheffield in the UK, but now in use for more than 10 years, been all around the world, UK to South Africa. The reason is it's modular. You can use it as the full-size thing, or you can use it as a very small building of 2,000 square meters, so you can use it in lots of different ways. And if a part goes, you just replace that part. You don't have to replace lots of parts. Very clever, prefabricated, modular thinking. This is a show. God's Kitchen is a big sort of rave disco show which goes around Europe, and as you can see, quite an environment. So, all these examples show that good portable architecture fulfills its specific purpose when it's required and where it's required, expresses this purpose in its form, utilizes unpredictable resources and servicing, adapts to unpredictable demands, provides more for less, and is efficient in form, lightweight in nature, and flexible in purpose. It also shows that it demands more care in design, favors multidisciplinary design processes, stretches current technology, encourages innovation, encourages strategies that are usable in all architecture, and is an option for every building type. But architecture is a discrete object, sculptural, meaningful, beautiful. Change, as we appreciate from nature, human nature, as well as the world around us, is an essential process of renewal. Architecture is a work in process. So in designing it, remember, portable architecture is architecture first and portable second. Thank you.
Let's begin. I was touched and delighted that Jennifer started off her introduction by mentioning the futurist group, and I'm so relieved she didn't mention one of the items on their manifesto which referred to the gangrene of professors. And it's the item that deals with the destruction of museums and churches, cathedrals and so on, and the elimination of the gangrene of professors from the universities. And I don't know how many of the students in the audience will drink to that. I also want to suggest to Robert, in his lovely presentation, which was a wonderful survey course of what's been done, and the best of the stuff, I have to say, I want you to think about at least adding a rather silly addition, which is not really silly at all. It's actually quite profound. But at Cooper Union back in New York, I'm doing a project at the moment where the students are making drawings of a scene from a Buster Keaton movie. Buster Keaton was a famous silent movie star, and this movie was made in 1924. It was called Sherlock Jr. It involves Buster as a young chap, and he's just married his sweetheart, but the guy she rejected so she could marry Buster is bent on revenge. And he takes the crates, the 3 crates of a house that Buster has ordered from some manufacturing company, and it's a kit of parts house. This is 1924, mind. And what he does, the evil rejected lover, rubs out the numbers on the crates and substitutes them for other numbers. So when Buster builds his house, it's got gables sticking out horizontally and windows which are sloping like that. And it's rather extraordinary. Surreal, one might say, even. And in the end, he's informed that he's built the house in the wrong place, so it becomes mobile. And he has to haul it in a truck, and he carries it over a grade crossing. And of course we know what's going to happen. And inevitably, needless to say, the truck stalls right across the rails, and we hear the train coming. We think, oh no, that's it. Train comes, but it's on the other track, and the house is okay. So we sit there full of relief. Oh, how wonderful. But in a typical Buster Keaton way, there's another train coming from the other direction. Need I say any more? But I thought, you know, in terms of a mobile house carrying this crazy house with the gables out horizontally, it's worthy of inclusion. So now to my own bit, and this is where I suppose I have to plug in. Hey, did it actually? There we are. Now, this may seem strange. You were probably expecting something archigrammy. It'll come, but just be patient. This is a group of, what, about 9 or 10 houses forming, what, their townhouses as part of a development, I think in Colorado. And the real estate biz, of course, would prefer me to use the word homes rather than houses, but never mind. I looked up the word development, and the best definition I got was the bringing out of what is potentially in something, which I thought was a very nice definition, actually. But there was no definition of the word development which suggested the supplanting of one environment by the installation of another. And that's what has happened here, really. Now, if you drive down the street, what you see is not houses, of course, but garages. The rooms of the houses seem all hidden behind, which is rather extraordinary to me. What about chance interactions? What about the old neighborhood stoop, where mom and pop would sit on the stoop, rocking backwards and forwards in the sofa? And all that's gone here, and I suspect the folks who live there never think twice about that. I don't think they feel they're lacking something. seems a shame to me. And another thing is that the environment that was destroyed to enable this to happen, little fragments of it remain in that which replaces it, especially in the names of the roads. That road, for all I know, might be called Deer Run. Where I live in the suburbs, there's a street called Sheep Pasture Road. There is no pasture on this road, and there are certainly no sheep. But what appalls me in a development like this, and I use the word development now, is the fact that you're completely cocooned on the way to it inside your car. And you drive into the garage, and by the way, prior to your return, you've probably programmed the clicker on your top, and you've set the oven to cook. You've rearranged the thermostat to read 70 degrees, and already the garage door is starting to roll up, and you in your cocoon drive into a larger cocoon, which is the garage, walk through into your house. You never have to suffer the external environment. Now, when we in Archogram started rethinking some of these situations, we perpetuated that condition. Nevertheless, I'm going to show you that first project. Oh, that's not supposed to come up. Now, if the lecture could have a title, From Car to House, because that's what really I've been talking about with the first project, the passage from the car to the house. No one handled it better or more interestingly than old Vignola in the mid-1600s. This is the Palazzo Farnese in Caprarola. And I remember this from my history of architecture lectures. And there was a Professor Broodbank at the Polytechnic in London who spun this wonderful story about the way the signor and the signora arrived back at their mansion, which may or may not be true, because he was a wonderful chap for elaborating on the realities of the situation. He said that the stage, not the stagecoach, but actually the coach and horses are, is that a clicker? Pointer. A pointer. Yeah, where do I, let's show me. All right.
No, let's just do a regular.
Oh, that's just a pen. Well, if I do that, never mind. That's fine. Bottom left, bottom center, the coach would arrive, drawn by 4 magnificent horses. The signor and the signora would step down and be lifted into, well, I don't know if you know about this, sedan chairs, which was really a little tiny room, no bigger than a chair, with 2 poles running through it. And lackeys would pick it up, one in the front, one in the back, and haul it up to the next stage. And that's what happened here. Having deposited the Lord and Lady, the horses would pull the coach into the stables, which is that door, center foreground. That was the stables where the horses would be watered, fed, and so on. And the coach would pull in there too. The lackeys would haul signor and signora up the steps going round. Oh, lovely, thank you very much. Top one? Bottom one. Okay, thanks. There we go. So they would be hauled up like that. Then they would get out of the sedan chair at that level and continue on foot into the mansion, the sedan chairs would be put in through that door there. So gradually they discard all their vehicles and end up on foot walking into the mansion, which I thought was a beautiful thing to do. So underground are all these garages that contain the various elements they're using. And I think it's interesting, when you have a symmetrical situation like that, and here I am, I'm the signor, and there's my beautiful signora. Do I walk up the left staircase and she up the right? Because surely we can't walk together because it destroys the symmetry of the arrangement. And we meet each other at the top. Now, we proceed on, and this is a project dating from about 1969. If perhaps the great curse of our environment today and of the development spreading like a cancer all over the country is the profligacy of the highway system, I've devised here a system, a method by which you have electric runabout vehicles, such as the one there, which has traveled along a trackway, a guided trackway, and when it arrives at the base of the high-rise apartment building, it divides into two parts. Its chassis is stored down below here, like various cartridges in a clip. And now the car, minus its chassis, awaits the descent of a traveling crane, which descends to pick it up and then carry it up to the appropriate apartment in the sky. There it is on its way up. There it is pressing the car into the apartment, and it becomes, when it opens out, like in that position there, it becomes additional living space. There's something rather wasteful, I think, about the car sitting in the driveway, unused for probably 2/3 of the day. There it is, appointed with quadraphonic sound, you name it, printer, stereo, so on and so on. You could go on for a long time, just sitting there doing nothing. So often the car in the driveway is more luxuriously appointed than the furniture of the living room. And here's a way in which you can have one set of equipment which is in use all day long. And I think it would be fantastic, and it's a drawing, you always feel this, you do a drawing, but the doing of one drawing only propels you into doing the next drawing. The next drawing is the front elevation, looking from there at the building, somehow in an animation showing the cranes traveling up and down doing their stuff. On the right-hand side, additional rooms sliding up again from a storeroom down there, which create additional living space for that party at the weekend. All right. Now, in a sense, that previous project approximates the sense of a drive-in movie theatre, which basically involves the management providing the movie screen, the concessions, the sound equipment, and an area of parking. And you, as the customer, bring along your own mini privatized auditorium with wheels. If you apply that to the notion of the house, you would have the storage units coloured grey and the little electric runabouts orange. And how do we make it animate? Do we just press the far button? Shall I see what happens? No, it goes back. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Great. Okay, babe, animate. Come on. Move. There we are. So the cars are coming back, and the building is getting bigger as a result. There we are. So if I want to make it, John, if I want to make it go back, which button do I push? Oh, it's doing it anyway. How do I stop it? It won't stop. End of piece. Oh, you just do that. Okay, did you get that? Anyway, these projects you're looking at were really the result of the early days of Archigram, when the six of us would go to a greasy spoon. And for those of you who are not familiar with the British Isles, that is a very cheap truck stop type of diner where the cutlery you get is sort of slightly greasy to the touch, you know, and there's a bowl of sugar and there's a spoon to spoon sugar into your coffee, but the spoon is attached via a chain to a hook in the ceiling so you can't walk off with the spoon. It's that sort of place. And we would have conversations which would usually start off with, wouldn't it be great if one could do this, if one could do that? And there'd be an ensuing conversation, and then we'd go home and draw it. So a drawing like this and a project like this, I want you to understand, is not the result of many weeks of serious thought. It's a quick response. And it's almost like a scattershot solution where maybe 1 out of 20 possibilities will be worth pursuing. But I think, as a trip down memory lane, it's nice to run over this stuff, you see. Okay. And of course, one of the most poignant and epic images, I think, of the drive-in movie scene, which is not really a drive-in movie theater, but you may not know about this. This is the Michigan Theater in Detroit, which used to be what's called a legitimate theater, and then ended its days, sadly, and they installed a parking garage in it. But it's almost like the theatre for cars, is it not? And there's this grand, beautiful old theatre. And here is another one of these silly, wonderful, I shouldn't say that, should I, boasting, but one of these wonderful projects where the drive-in house goes off in a different direction. You have, all right, this is, what's red in this drawing is a horizontal section cut, meaning it's sliced through a partially underground house like that. On the left, image number 1, you have an access tube called intake, and the car drives into a rotating drum, and you see the car there, and the white line coming out is the line of sight, the direction of looking of the driver. And one of the conventions of architectural drawing is that you enter a building, as you know, I'm sure, from the lower edge. And that convention is followed in terms of the way the driver is looking. by following the rules, one totally confuses the issue. In image 2, the drum has rotated, but we must follow the conventions and maintain the line of sight vertically. But that means that the intake tube is now about 40 degrees going off to the right. In the last one, the car is fully inside the schematic house, not yet shown in detail, so that the house is penetrated by the car and becomes part of the furniture at the house. Now the intake tube is sticking off to the right at a rather alarming angle. This idea was generated from the fact that a student of mine at Cooper many years ago was driving a Wankel engine car, which is this. That's the Wankel rotary engine, which is such. Can we appreciate the beauty of the motion? We tried to get an animation working of this to no avail. Not this image, but a cartoon, a diagrammatic one, of a triangular rotor which rotates within that cylindrical drum, where the points of the rotor maintain constant contact with the cylinder. And how long have I got? I mean, my time is up, is it? Maybe I should, because maybe I'll run through the rest of them quickly. Huh? Okay, good. So you've seen that. Isn't that beautiful? The sheer elegance, thank you, the elegance of it. This probably, I think, almost the last project I want to show. This is Drive In to the Extreme, project dating from 1966. It's a drawing that my daughter Rebecca would love to own, but the trouble is it doesn't exist anymore, it's lost. But it's called Venus Anadyomene Entering the Inflatable Enclosure. Inflatables were really big in the 60s, as Robert will attest to, eh? And she is wearing a garment rather like an inflatable skin bag, probably a shopping bag, one of those string bags drawn tight at the neck. And she's wearing it, and it's all drawn tight over her tummy. And she walks up to this inflatable enclosure, which has that same string bag neck. She presses her neck against it, and it starts to open out. So she finds herself inside the inflatable. And if you look closely, you can see her in images on the left, very faintly and mysteriously. And there she is on the right. She's almost fully in. And that led to, actually this is an oil painting, and there she is in her cushicle, which stands for cushion air vehicle. And I somehow thought it would be interesting if her body was almost indistinguishable from the structure of the inflatable enclosure, which requires she be bald. And why not advertise anyway? And so actually the air cushion vehicle is this, oh no, that's on. There's the hovercraft, and there's the structure of it to which is attached this inflatable enclosure. And what she's doing here is raising herself up into the vertical position. First she's at that sloping angle, and the orange line is actually a section cut. Doesn't really work all that well, really. And the string bag is opening up. There it is, just beginning to open, more so there, finally almost completely open there. We go on. Another sketch version, trying to represent in drawing the nature of an enclosure. One last one, and I think this is important. This is a one, Jared L. Surfbine, whom you've never heard of, in his SUV, stuck on the LIE. Oh, well, how did we get to that? Now, why did that happen? Anyway, it doesn't matter, you've got the picture. Oh, look, this saint here is coming to my rescue. Here it is. Thank you very much, old chap. But in terms of the conversation, I think this is a very important image. Here he is, stuck on the LIE, and I'm quoting from the New York Times, "But he mindeth not one jot." There we are, thanks very much. Why? He's on his way of a Friday evening out to the Hamptons to visit his mansion, and he's got all the stuff in his car, laptop, you know, you name it, he's got it there, and he's getting a vast amount of work done while edging along about 3 miles an hour. Now, in his office back in Manhattan, he can't get a damn thing done because pesky people are coming in all the time asking stupid questions. This is the only place he can accomplish anything. And that's why he likes it so much. And I think a true usage map of Manhattan showing the prevalence of office space would of course show the buildings he's in. But since this is his office, as much as it is his vehicle, say that the office space in Manhattan was denoted with a little yellow area, each room a little yellow rectangle, wouldn't they have to show his car as a yellow rectangle on the LIE? And since there are probably 100,000 other hotshot lawyers, executives and the like, all spreading out on Friday evening from the city, wouldn't there be a whole diaspora of yellow rectangles spreading out? And the reverse, of course, Sunday evening. So we're really redefining. My last comment is from David Green, the archigrammer, who is taking a walk in the country. A guy is coming towards him, speaking on his cell phone. He interrupts the guy and says, "Where are you going?" And the guy responds, "I'm going to my office." And David responds, "But you are in your office." Now, there may be one, no there isn't, that's it. Good, okay.
The sacred presentation of Michael Webb to my more profane approach, and but it's a delight to be here. Very, very wonderful to be invited. And the subtitle of this event this evening, Motopia, and a new age for modular construction, has really prompted some reflection on my part. Is it in fact a new age? Are we in a new age or a continuation of the same age for modular construction? It's a topic of huge fascination for most of the 20th century. Jennifer began with St. Elia, the futurists' preoccupation with the form of speed and movement in the very early 20th century. And what I want to propose to you is that I think there is, in fact, a nascent new age for modular construction before us. And the difference has to do really between questions of form and performance. I would submit that in the 20th century, the pursuit of modularity and modular construction was largely driven by a fascination with the form of speed and the speed of items such as ships, planes, aircraft, that their insertion into our lives really became the driving force for the fascination of much of the 20th century with modular construction. For us today, I'm going to suggest that it's the driving force of what may become a new paradigm has to do with performance and building form around performance rather than about an image of performance, rather about actual performance. This is always a really startling image that I'm going to begin with this evening. It shows the productivity of our economy here in the United States from the mid-1960s, more or less, to the present, increasing about 220%. So that means basically that we have been able to make more in less time and at lower cost in a rather consistent way with continuous improvement since the mid-1960s in all sectors of our economy except for construction, which is the red line at the bottom, where we've declined about 20 to 25% over the same time frame. That's a pretty alarming statistic. And I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons for the fascination of or with modularity today in the 21st century is this diagram. It's about altering that performative decline. Similarly, at the same time, our industry at the top, the building industry, has become the most substantial single user of energy in the United States and in general on the earth. You can see a flattening out of industry's own use of energy, but there's been no flattening out of our use of energy and our expenditure of carbon on the earth. Again, I'm going to suggest that coupled with the economic performance of our profession, and unify that performance with our energy performance. And there is a new realm here for speculation on modularity in the century we are now in. With that in mind, in our own practice, we undertook restructuring our firm about 15 years ago around a research core and reorganizing every part of our enterprise to support a research core that could drive the design of our buildings with the belief that some of the constraints that we could generate, performative constraints, be they energy constraints or economic constraints, could generate beautiful, wonderful form. One of the first things we did about a dozen years ago was go back and revisit the topics that earlier 20th century architects found so fascinating, from Saint-Elia, certainly through Le Corbusier and others, basically cars, aircraft, and large boats. But instead of looking at how those things moved about the world and their form, we decided to go into their underlying performance, because these are artifacts that are, like buildings, very large, extremely complex. They integrate many, many systems, and they have to move at substantial speeds. So we decided to go back and look at them because they have found ways to enhance and increase their performance over the last 4 to 5 decades when our industry has moved in the opposite direction. So we crisscrossed the United States and overseas looking at how these things were made and trying to understand the processes underlying their making. And at the bottom of this is the following formula, literally. And it's one that's been with me since my first job in architecture. My first boss said to me, "You'll never get around the formula at the top of this image. That if you want more quality and scope and features and scale in your architecture, you're going to have to, in equal measure, invest more cost and time." At the same time, the world in which we're living in the 21st century doesn't really believe in that formula anymore, doesn't believe that that's a limit any longer. And we've constantly are confronted by clients who come out of the industrial world, the world that makes other large complex things and small complex things. And in that world, the underlying belief is that the paradigm today is we need to improve quality and scope and expand them out of all proportion to cost and time, and do so in an environmentally responsible way. So I would submit that this is the new paradigm, and the basis for it that is underlying modular production and construction in our century, in the 21st century. And this is why it may in fact be different and be a different age than the prior century. When we looked at how these things were made, there were a couple of simple underlying facts. One was they did not stitch things together one by one in the field, as we continue to do with our buildings today. Instead, they developed complex aspects of these planes, ships, and aircraft and cars, such as a dashboard assembly, somewhere else. They completely modified the mode of production and asked suppliers to fabricate something as complex as that dashboard on the right, with about 205 separate parts, somewhere else. And then in essence, they have quilting bees. They bring together a relatively limited number of parts, not thousands of them, but a few dozen, to quilt them together, either into aircraft, cars, or planes. So we asked the question, learning from those processes, how might we start to restructure our industry, the design and construction industry, around some of those models, and develop integrated component assemblies of all different sorts, whether or not they're bathrooms or complex assemblies of doors with all their attendant equipment and machinery that is required to operate them today. How we might start to develop integrated component assemblies that would allow our buildings to be basically quilted together rather than woven or stitched together. So what I'm going to share with you in the next few minutes here is 5 explorations, or inquiries is what we like to call them in our firm, into this whole topic of 21st century modularity viewed from a performative basis. In our case, all of these are built projects or about to be built projects. So, but in each instance, we asked ourselves a fundamental question. In this case, it was about the quality of the artifact, the craft of design and construction, and about the quality of its environmental performance and in less time. And note, we've left money out of this equation. This was not an inexpensive dwelling. We began by asking, what are the elements of this new architecture? And in this case, we came up with 5. Wall cartridges, floor cartridges, a scaffold to support the whole structure, blocks for mechanical rooms and bathrooms, and equipment, operating equipment. And we set forth the notion that we wouldn't have any hammers or saws out on the site, and that the biggest and most important tool, most dominant tool, would be the ratchet wrench. The first act of design wasn't the building. It was the supply chain to provide the building. The goal remains the form. It remains beautiful, moving form for us, as it does for any architect that really deserves the term or the title architect, but the methods underlying it really had to be redesigned first. So we looked again to the processes of some of the industries that we studied and restructured the supply chain more or less along the lines of the automotive industry, basically accumulating suppliers from tier 1 into a lesser number of integrated component assemblies, or tier 3 into a lesser number of integrated component assemblies in tier 2. And those were then aggregated yet again and provided through a tier 1 supplier to the site where they were assembled, not constructed, but assembled. At the same time, this whole process of building is a pretty messy affair compared to shipbuilding or aircraft or automotive manufacture, because our things fundamentally don't move. They are normally fastened to sites. And Robert described lots of things that do, but relatively few buildings actually move with regularity. So there's this whole question of the site and bringing the site to these other elements that becomes the kind of messy part of assembly here. So here it is. We used a new tool available to us that didn't exist in the 20th century, parametric modeling, that allowed us to fabricate all these parts simultaneously to a tolerance of 1 millimeter, order them all online, and have them all arrive at the site and all fit together with a tolerance of 1 millimeter. So that was an important difference from the prior century for us. And basically 4 carpenters of no exceptional skill put the scaffold up in a couple of days on top of the platform for the house. Then we developed what we call cartridges. They're floor assemblies that have structure in them. They contain all the systems of the building, the heating, the cooling, the electrical systems and distributions are in these cartridges. And they're clad top and bottom with finishes and lifted into the house. And again, they're all made from this parametric model using Hundegger computer-driven equipment in a factory in New Hampshire, and ultimately conveyed in cartridge form in a few tractor trailers to Maryland. You can see them being built in a factory in the dead of winter with the radiant heating system being installed here and then lifted into position. The bathrooms and mechanical rooms, we used a tactic of true modularity rather than planarity. These are spaces built again in a factory with all of the equipment, be it mechanical equipment in the lower left or the finishes for the bathroom installed in that factory, so that the element on the right, when it's lifted into position, has all the building's operating mechanics and one of the bathrooms in it. And the result is a return, we believe, to control of the precision of our craft of design. This is far more precise than any field-built building that we've been able to execute to date, largely because of the modularity and the off-site fabrication and the computerized control tools. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some environmental performance on this dwelling. It was conceived not as an envelope, but rather as a filter. The average home in the United States today basically is zipped up real tight, and then we just pump energy into them and let it leak out. So the fundamental objective here was to use a different concept, basically one of filtration, where we would manage the energy that the world was giving us already into and out of the house. And we did that through a series of glider doors, airplane glider doors, clad with polycarbonate that you can see here, that coupled with sliding interior doors. They're all bifolding doors that can completely open or close the house. Those two systems allow the house to function fundamentally as a filter. We can allow air into it and as the sun comes around to the west, start to shield the structure from the sun, or completely open it after the sun goes down. And in bad weather or the winter, we can completely close it and use it basically as a solar trap that traps energy that is usable for the dwelling. You can see on a performance basis that when closed in the dead of winter, those cavities, the cavities outside the dwelling that capture the sun in the afternoon as it goes down, generate about 30% of the energy needed to go from a 30-degree temperature outside to a 70-degree temperature inside the house. That's basically all just captured passive energy, what is described in the bottom as buffering. The other huge discovery for us over the past few years, as we've explored these concepts of modularity, is that just as you can put something together faster, a huge benefit of modularity is that you can also disassemble it swiftly. And it wasn't something we were necessarily motivated by at the outset, but we're hugely motivated by it now. Loblolly House, you can see, contains about 205,000 pounds of carbon in it. And one of the thoughts about it was that we could take it apart in the same way we put it together whole, and reuse all the pieces as something other than a house even. They could be basically resold for other purposes or the same purpose when the house had lived its life. And this is huge because what fundamentally happens with dwellings in the United States is their material life outlives their real estate life. They are terminated as dwellings, not because the materials no longer have value, but because the dwelling is in the wrong place and the real estate value of the property about it doesn't support its ongoing existence. So this matter of carbon recovery, we think, is a huge one. The end result of exploring all these constraints and using all the constraints is art. And we need the constraints to make wonderful art and houses of desire for people to live in. Steve Glenn is here this evening. He's a client of ours, and we've collaborated and are continuing to collaborate on how to basically convert some of these ideas and ideals into mass customizable high-performance homes for a broader marketplace. And I think that's the fundamental underlying mission of living homes. Why is this important? Well, of the approximately 114 million dwelling units that existed here in 2008, a tiny amount of them are new in any given year. It's a relatively small amount. Only 825,000 units in 2008, just on the cusp of the recession. And of those, only about 28% of them are architect designed. So if we're going to make any substantial headway, this question of modularity is a huge topic. One of the reasons why site-built homes haven't made much advance in environmental and other economic performative terms, we believe, is that it's a highly fragmented industry here in the U.S. Lots and lots of builders put up only a handful of homes in any given year, and they make up a large part of the marketplace. By building integrated component assemblies in factories and supplying those to those small builders, we might make substantial headway in both economic and productivity terms and environmental terms, because the factory could have the capacity to develop higher performing systems. It's a huge topic to really go after the broader marketplace. And that's certainly the whole mission of living homes. This is the basic assembly idea. It's one of modules and panels that underlies the living homes approach. And you can see one home here that's already had 3 locations, very unusual, but it's already had 3 different locations in its short life. It was built originally for the National Association of Home Builders conference up in convention up in Las Vegas. Then it was moved to the TED conference after the Home Builders convention was over, and erected at the TED conference. And you can see it in these 2 images at that conference. And it's now been sold to a couple in Newport Beach, California, and was erected in this suburban subdivision in Newport Beach. And I understand from Steve we have another one underway in Santa Monica, just beginning as we speak. So, a third question relates to New Orleans and the post-Katrina housing problems and dilemmas of New Orleans. And for us, it was a question of how could we evolve these principles to work in that environment. And this is a prototype of the house we did for Make It Right, Brad Pitt's foundation. And our fundamental underlying premise here is that this is about jobs and housing. It's about jobs and shelter. That because of the volume of the problem and the scale of the problem in New Orleans and the amount of dwelling units needed, the thought was that they could develop specific expertise in modular assembly and capacity to build modular integrated component assemblies off-site, and develop an economy within the city of New Orleans to provide jobs as well as housing. And you can see the exploration here of mass customizable ideas that basically assemblies that are parts of this house could be combined in different ways based on the specific desires of the inhabitant and reconfigured in many different combinations and parts. About 8 of these dwellings have been erected already in the lower 9th Ward by Make It Right. They are high-performance dwellings in many ways, and they have worked consistently, and this is one of the messages about modular design and construction, because they're building about 250 dwellings, not 1 or 2. They've been able to be very introspective about their performance on each one, and they started off at about $240 to $250 a square foot, and by basically critiquing what they've done in each instance and trying and exploring different approaches as they move through it, they've halved the cost of the dwelling to about $120 to $140 a square foot in only a matter of a few years by basically really going to work on this and working hard at it. And the result, we think, is a dwelling that will withstand the next flood, and it's surely coming, unlike the one on the left that was rebuilt immediately after the Hurricane Katrina in exactly the same way it existed before. It's a dwelling that has more than halved the operating cost of the house it replaced, of similar size. It actually generates a lot of energy through its photovoltaics and is a source of income, excess income, for the owner of the dwelling. So very, very important set of undertakings that is starting to completely redevelop a new neighborhood, the first LEED Platinum neighborhood in the United States out of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Then we asked ourselves, when an opportunity came to put up a show home, in essence, for the Museum of Modern Art in New York City as part of their major exhibition called Home Delivery, we asked ourselves this question. In the context of a place like New York City, how might we build taller, lighter, and faster, and then look at the swift disassembly and recycling of all the components of the house. And the result was cellophane house with Sarin and CBS building in the background on a lot next to the museum on 53rd Street. And Our underlying premise here basically was about the joint. And you can see the joints developed here for stacking and unstacking this dwelling that allow it to be quickly assembled and disassembled on the site. Here it is in a factory in New Jersey, Coleman's plant in Lebanon, New Jersey, with all of the pieces under assembly on an assembly line. And here it is going up. What you're looking at now went up over the course of about 2 weeks. The elements going up on the back contain staircases, the staircases for the house. The ones going up on the front have operable hinged doors that completely open the front. The tarps are going on at the end of a day to cover it. And in between those elements on the front and back, floor cartridges are put in with bathrooms on top of 2 of them, mounted on 2 of them. So those cartridges basically connect the modules on the front and back of the house. All of it's stacking, literally, from one floor to the next with custom designed connectors for an off-the-shelf scaffold system developed by Bosch. And we're up to the top of the dwelling here. You can see the last level of the stair going in, and another piece on the front there. And there's also roof access. So the roof going on now is an accessible part of the house, with the last piece being lifted in. Then all the cladding for the house starts to go up. You can see a roof going up here. That's a solar-powered roof that provides a significant portion of the energy for the dwelling. And the wall panels are clad in PET plastic with thin film photovoltaics on them. It's a multi-layer wall assembly. And those panels were all lifted into position on a construction lift that you can see here. And that's it. So, the result, again, I think, is a house of pretty exceptional beauty. It's an artwork that we believe derives a lot of its art from performative questions, fundamentally, and performative constraints about time and energy. We monitor all our buildings when we're done, and we did performance monitoring on this wall assembly. The idea was generated here to really make a high-performance wall out of 2 thin layers of plastic by managing heat in and out of that wall when we wanted it or did not want it. And we developed a system to test its performance. And then we took it apart. We had a comparable amount of time, about 2 weeks, to disassemble the house. And you can see it being taken down here. And note, it's not being pulverized. The image on the left I took on my way to work one morning in Philadelphia. We're taking down right now about 20,000 brick row homes from the first 3 to 4 decades of the 20th century. They're brick homes, really solid, and they're no longer viable. As I indicated earlier, they're not viable because the materials aren't viable. They're not viable because the neighborhoods they're in aren't viable, and they've not been cared for, and they've fallen into ruin and through neglect. But they're being pulverized. Every single material in them is being pulverized as opposed to disassembled. And the end result at Cellophane House is that we believe we can recover about 90% of the carbon in the materials of that house when it comes down. We sold off the 2 bathrooms. They're now in another building that Coleman provided. We've sold off a lot of the aluminum, and it's being used in factories for manufacturing purposes. But we've recovered a lot of the materiality of the house. So I guess you could say the house has moved, but not in any conventional way that we would have thought of in terms of 20th century modularity. Instead, it's moved by taking itself apart, basically cannibalizing itself, and spreading those parts around the world for different uses. And that, I think, is a real provocative way to start to think about modularity and movement as we move into this new century is fundamentally driven by carbon management and retention of embodied energy and materials. Again, and I keep coming back to this, for us it's all of these constraints we're operating with that generates memorable, potent, and high art architecture. And then lastly, a question of some of the emerging markets around the U.S., or beyond the United States, overseas markets. And we're working on projects in both India and Malaysia right now, taking on, in other cultural and climatic circumstances, the whole question of modularity and dwelling. This one happens to be in Malaysia. It's for a real estate development company and a large-scale conglomerate called Sime Darby. And you can see an analysis of some of the historic dwelling types and how they work from an environmental perspective, and the development of a new dwelling there. These images, I'm sorry to say, were lost, but this is the final result of this house, and it's developed again modularly in factories in Malaysia, and the intent is to assemble it in approximately 2 weeks as a high-end development house in Malaysia. And lastly, a view of that dwelling. I'm going to end this this evening with Henry Ford, and I'm going to come back to Alison Arif's challenge at the start of it and her observation that the whole question of modularity in construction is largely a failed movement. And I believe that's pretty accurate. I don't think we are anywhere near fulfilling the potential and the possibilities of modularity. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But the biggest reason is just sheer simple persistence, or the lack of persistence. It's in honor of Motopia that I put the Ford image up, but it's also a little known and even less dwelled upon fact that it's called Model T because it's the 20th letter in the alphabet. And there were 19 failed prototypes that didn't make it to market, or not for long in any event before this one. And it's clearly the car that changed the physical and cultural landscape of America, and has continued to this day to do so. But we've not demonstrated the same persistence, frankly, in the architectural and construction industries that Henry Ford had. Basically, there are too many one-off prototypes. I think there's a lot of fascination with the topic, but not a lot of hard work, not a lot of real sophisticated engineering know-how and process engineering know-how that's been brought to it. So I think our problem and the reason why it has largely been a failed movement to date is just lack of will and persistence. So, thank you.
So we'll just go to about 7, but I have a load of questions. Maybe I can come up here. Thank you all. That was great. I sort of don't know where to begin, so I'm going to go all over the place. And maybe we'll get to take a few from the audience as well. Apropos of everything yet nothing that you've all just discussed, the population hit 7 billion this week, and in terms of all this portability, mobility, flexibility, et cetera, where does architecture go with that? how do we best respond to the growing challenges of population and increasing urbanism? And we start with you.
Let's start with an easy one then. Golly, thanks a lot for that, Alison. Well, I kind of, this isn't a cop-out, but you know, architects are just architects. The big problems in the world are economic, social, cultural, and architects exist in a world of basically looking for patrons who will design appropriate, who allow them to design the hopefully fitting solutions. I do believe that some of the things that have been talked about here, though, are very interesting in terms of your question, because the one thing architects can do, and which my two colleagues here do very well, is dream. And dream of appropriate solutions to problems when they see them, and are very good as well at visualizing those solutions and trying to get people to look at them. We're not always successful in that, but at least if solutions are placed before the correct eyes, then there's a chance that they might get built. But you know, the problems, it's really, I think the solution to that problem really comes from political, social, and economic will, and it's a difficult one.
I realize that was a bit unfair. I don't know if we get less feedback if we use these. Is that one on?
Yeah, that's on.
So a little bit to that end, and maybe I've become too much of the voice of practicality since I have to write for the op-ed section of the Times, and my editor at the Times asks me things like, who are the Eameses? Explain. So I'm constantly needing to explain things. Stephen, you talk a lot about architecture as art, and that you mentioned that one of the failures of prefab is persistence, but I might say that one of the failures seems to me the curse of the one-off, that someone comes up with the great concept for the single house and they can build that one house, but we've not seen the kind of scale necessary, and I wonder if you can speak to that and if you see any changes happening.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a fair critique of prefab. It's a bit of a fetish, I think, at the moment, and the real challenge is how to turn it from a fetish into a business, to be blunt about it, and not necessarily a business that doesn't produce beautiful architecture. I think it can, and in most instances where it's been successful as a business, and it is, as you pointed out, hugely successful already in the United States, in that a huge proportion of our housing is built modularly already, but it is successful in that regard as a business that has no art in it, and are really not places that human beings, all things considered, would really desire to live in. So, you know, how we get from where we are now, I don't know. If I had the answer to that question, I wouldn't be sitting here talking right now. I'd be Henry Ford of the house world, and we'd be off doing it. So, but fundamentally, if you think about it, it's already a huge business with a quarter of the U.S. housing being built that way. All we have to figure out how to do is how to bring art to performance. And I don't know why the two are so intractably inseparable. I just don't get it.
But isn't it, shall I throw away that looking at the history of modular housing and prefabricated housing designed by the likes of Buckminster Fuller, Gropius, Waxman, Conrad Waxman, all these people who designed it in the language of modern architecture. And that was one of the reasons I would suggest that only, well, I think the Dymaxion house by Buckminster Fuller, which looked really like a stainless steel saucepan with a dome lid. It was very difficult to sell it aesthetically to the great American public out there. And one reason why modular housing as it exists is successful is because it looks like a house. You've got fake shutters on the sides of the windows and all the rest of it. And I can't see any way of overcoming that. If we want to enter that market, we have to be prepared to have vinyl siding, you know, that from a distance looks like clapboard. I mean, am I being unduly cynical in that?
No, not at all.
But so you know, that's the issue. One of the big issues, I would say.
Oh, I would completely agree. I've spent the last several years touring various subdivisions and working with master plan community developers, and they have a moderate interest in performance and an interest in what they might consider art. I mean, I visited a subdivision in Las Vegas that each house was named after an impressionist painter. It's quite sad, really. But I think that art and performance is part of it. But Michael, you talked a lot about cars, and I think cars is a huge part of it. And I feel, and I'd love for you to address this a little bit, is that we've talked a lot about the house as object, as work of art, but I'm really quite interested in this point in talking about the house or homes, or even better, multifamily housing, a variety of housing options as a neighborhood and as a community, and that the shift in my brain needs to be more towards that, and in finding creative ways to not make it be so much about the car, which is exactly what you showed in your presentations.
Well, yeah, I was, I suppose, attempting an expansion of the definition of what a car is. That it's not just a container for traveling around it. It becomes many additional things. So I think the line between the house, as we know it, the home, I should say, and the car becomes somewhat blurred. Mm-hmm. But actually, when you look at those projects, the engineering required to make that possible rather puts the whole notion out of court, you know. So it actually requires the precision of a spacecraft or whatever to make something like that happen. Wouldn't you say?
No, very much so. And the dilemma of the car, you know, I'm not sure what terms you were asking about it on, but it sounded like you were suggesting that the question of community making fundamentally depends in a way on not having the car be part of the equation. And
not necessarily removing the car, but right now the car is sort of the sole. It plays a disproportionate role in how communities of homes are planned. And so if you continue to look at the house as a singular object that one needs a car to get to, that's not going to change. And it feels to me like that fundamentally needs to shift in order to see any real change in modularity or anything else.
And that is fundamentally a cultural, political, and economic problem, and not one in the U.S. that there's any will to, on the regulatory or political side, to take on. So it has to become a completely economic, I think, an economically driven movement. And is it possible to look ahead and foresee economic forces that might move us in that direction? You know, it's certainly possible. If energy costs keep moving the way they're moving, that might become the ultimate impetus for this. But you know, but I don't see it coming about based on the free will of the American public, and nor on the part of our politicians and their ability to regulate or desire to regulate land planning and other matters.
But to that end, and I'll get you back in here. I loved what you said about temporary and tactical urbanism, and that you gave this amazing list for all the reasons why temporary was important, and in fact that temporary could really last a long time. And there's so many incredible interventions happening in the sort of portable temporary realm, in large part because there's not government backing and stuff. And maybe you can speak to, some of the sort of exciting developments you've seen in this area. And you did a great overview, but I'm sure that you're seeing a lot more.
No, I think, temporary gets a bad word, really, a bad name. I think temporary's not necessarily something which is bad or evil, providing that the thing which is being made temporarily is kind of completely recyclable or reusable or readaptable straight on, because temporary is in effect responsive. Mm-hmm. Just talking about this idea of the housing particularly, I don't think prefabrication is a failure. 25% of all homes in the US, and not quite 25%, but maybe 20% of homes in Europe are prefabricated. In the US, it's the manufactured housing industry. And a few years ago, I went down to Florida and I went round these factories. And the factories are fascinating because they welcome the public in. And the public are there on their little tours going around the factories. They have outside, they have the lot where they have half a dozen homes which you can go and look at. And I met with some of the guys who own these factories and asked them how they worked. And it was very simple. They said, well, we design our buildings directly in response to what our clients want. We ask them, when they come in and they ask us for something different, we say, yeah, we can do that, no problem. And so you do tend to get these things like the same basic building. You can have it in New England style, in Neo-Georgian, even Adobe, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. Adobe mobile homes are just amazing. I just want one for my garden, I don't care what you say. And they're absolutely great. And the other thing they sell on this flexibility, this absolute, but the other thing they sell on is the fact that they sell on the quality of the product. They're saying our product, for instance, in Florida, where, hurricanes are a big problem, we design them to a very, very high standard. So if there is a hurricane, your building will survive. And so it's not rocket science, that stuff. People are buying them cheaper, and they're buying them, in stuff that we might not actually appreciate as designers, but actually is quite interesting in terms of the way they're developing it. And it's the same in Europe. Throughout most of southern Europe particularly, there are many, many mobile homes built exactly the same. Most of them are not permanent dwellings, interestingly. They're used as holiday buildings. And throughout Japan, companies like Mitsu and Toyota are making these buildings. Again, not really great architecture actually at all, but they're kind of like in a market. And I think that people like Jennifer and the other architects who are starting to work with these mobile home developers and bringing in issues like sustainable materials, different ways of sort of planning the building so that they operate in a different manner, are kind of, I think that's, for me, that would be a way forward, but I don't know if it's fully successful or not.
I'm going to see if anyone has a question in the audience. Right back.
Yes, I'd like to know, Steve, how well are you received by local building officials and inspectors? Especially in regard to like closing inspections, things like that, because like here in Culver City, just putting up a light pole could be a challenge.
Increasingly well. More and more municipalities are relying on third-party inspectors and certifying third-party inspections who can go into factories and certify compliance before the elements are closed up and have them be accepted by the field inspectors. And that's one of the only benefits of the downturn in the economy is they've laid off a lot of government workers and have outsourced a lot of inspections. So the unions can sometimes be problematic as well, but normally it's a matter of going to the labor unions, and they'll accept union labor from another location. In most instances, it can become problematic when you're using non-union labor in certain urban jurisdictions. But we've been able to negotiate it in our limited experience across both realms without problems whenever we've tried. So, just by being open and talking about it up front.
Do we have one more? You
talk about persistence, and I was thinking about the same issue you were talking about. In 1915, you could buy a house from Sears, and it was delivered to your house, all the components put it together yourself, no hammers and nails, no wires. And they sold thousands and thousands of them, and that's an idea that's been around for 100 years. If you went to the Montreal World's Fair in 1968, they had the Habitat modular construction thing similar to what you demonstrated here. So what happened in the 100 years or the 40 years since those events that Watt was doing?
Well, I think the Sears one was vastly more successful for a lot of reasons, and there's still a lot of those houses around, actually. Why it died off? Not quite sure. I think there was a period of time in the U.S. where prefabrication and modularity got a pretty bad name, and and returning servicemen in World War II really for a variety of reasons seemed to want stick-built, site-built homes, and they kind of took over the industry in the 1950s. I think as an architect, we're in a kind of endless cycle of designing prototypes, and when something doesn't work great, we abandon it and try and do something different. Instead of basically incrementalizing much smaller scale, more finely grained improvements, one after the other, and building on something until you've really solved the problem of the prototype and transformed it into a type, beyond proto that has the prospect of replication and capacity to kind of become the contemporary image of the Model T. And it's a really complex thing. I think today the Model T wouldn't do very well in the market today because it didn't have variations on it. So the models we're looking at today, I think, also require a certain degree of capacity to customize them through the process of design and fabrication, to have the capacity to give individuals what they want and order things in ways that allow them to put their own stamp on it and customize it. So, it's a vexing, problem, this whole perseverance problem. But I do think we are obsessively, we're forever obsessing about the novelty of everything we do as architects and trying way too hard not to repeat ourselves, and actually working with the same kit of parts again and again and again and just kind of staying with it does seem to me to be of value and maybe a way forward. I mean, Henry Ford didn't change those models. If we looked at the 19 ones before it, they wouldn't have looked a lot different. But they were all different in incremental ways, and at some point, it flipped over the top and became, a type that everybody had to have. And a lot of it was economic. He drove the cost of the custom one-off built car, ultimately down to several $100s. It was a fraction of the way anybody else could afford a car.
You could repair it also.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read The Grapes of Wrath, the car breaks down, and there they are. They removed some. Yeah. You could never do that today. And old people, when you talk to them, would say, well, you know, if I can't repair it with baling wire and the coffee can split up the middle, I don't want it. And I find it interesting that, say, when a new house is built, you can't tell whether it was built in 1910 or today. But if one tried to sell a 1930s style car, one would be met with derision, wouldn't one? But I want to say something.
Unless you were an antique car collector. But in general, yes.
Well, there's the exception to the rule, isn't it? Because you can have a Bugatti from 26 rebuilt.
Pretty nice.
Can't tell the difference. But I think I'm reminded by what you said of industrialized building, which is what it was called at one stage. And Ronan Point, do you remember that? That was a modular building. It was built, an apartment tower built out of concrete slabs, built like a house of cards. And I think I remember reading that a Miss Ivy Hodge, unable to sleep, living in apartment 15C, went to light the gas oven, and there was something wrong with the oven, and there was an explosion in the apartment. But it blew out the wall. Now, the apartments above her now had nothing to support them, and they came crashing down, just missing her. But it brought about a progressive collapse of the whole side of the building. And it was proven that the wall was misplaced in the first place. It shouldn't have happened. But because of that, it was the end of that sort of, no one would entertain the idea of doing a building like that anymore, which is a shame, actually, because it all made sense and it could be built in the factory and assembled at the site. But I just want to say also that we talk about improving and rationalizing building, but we're still, those buildings we rationalize and improve, they're still carted off to some suburban lot, and the owners end up driving an hour and a half to work every day. And that seems to be an issue that has to be, perhaps not by us in this room, but it's something.
But I think it needs to be in the frame of reference of the people in this room.
Yeah.
So, but on that note, because we're running really late and we do have a reception, I want to thank all of you again and thank everyone in the audience so much for coming.
I enjoy